Hello and welcome to Ark Academy. In today's video we'll cover the basics of Ark of Osiris, from scoring to team building, to strategy, to skills, and everything in between that may be relevant to you playing this game. One of my first series on this channel was a short series of the same name, where I covered the basics of Ark, but in today's video we're going to go in much more detail. I will leave timestamps in the description so that you can jump around to whatever area you'd like to see most if you're looking for specific information. Without further ado, let's get started. First, let's talk about the map. But to talk about the map, we need to define some things first. You'll be on one of two teams, the blue team or the red team, typically called Seth or Eset. But for all intents and purposes, you can call these teams whatever you would like. If you divide the map along the corners opposite these blue and red flag spawns, right here through the arc, you'll have two halves of the map. The defensive half will correspond to the spawn side that you have. So if you're the red team, this is your defensive half, whereas your offensive half is the half of the map that's further away. This is relevant for when you design strategies because the overall goal in every strategy is to at least hold your defensive half. On the offensive half of the field, even when you don't control the buildings, you can see them to click them and rally them, but you cannot see any troops around them, which will become relevant when we talk about strategies. Next, let's talk about buildings. The map is mirrored from bottom left to top right, meaning the bottom left of one map is the same as top right, and the top left of one map is the same as the bottom right. Meaning if you control one wing, when you divide the map down the middle, you control one of every building. Similarly to if you control all your defensive structures, you control one of every building. This means you have a lot of ways to get all the buildings you need. But there are two main types of buildings we're going to talk about: points buildings and stat buildings. So points buildings give you a larger amount of points. When you go to the scoring, you'll see that the points per minute is significantly higher for altars than it is for shrines, almost double in fact. So these buildings don't give you a buff, but it gives you the bulk of your point income, as all four buildings on the map will constitute a total of 600 points per minute, with the total amount of points you can get on the whole map only being about 1180. So if you can control all four altars on the map, you're guaranteed to be at an advantage. These buildings are crucial to hold for scoring, however, you don't get any special buffs from them. The other major building type is the buff building, known as the shrines right here. These give you a little bit less point-wise, but confer a small boost to your unit's stats, helping improve trades as a compromise for the reduced points. These are less relevant for scoring over the points buildings, but still carry a heavier importance than obelisks or outposts. Lastly, obelisks and outposts give much more reduced points and really don't have a function outside of the early capture phase. And most of the time, after the first 15 minutes, anything that the obelisk plays is more a distraction or a way to create pressure if your team is strong enough to teleport over and zero a player with your field troops instantly. As the 20 points per minute for an obelisk is not very relevant, and the 30 points for an outpost is a little more relevant, but the troops have to severely place themselves into your territory to be able to reach them, making it dangerous for them as well. Outside of the building, there are a few extra features on the map. First, of course, is the namesake of the game, the Ark. The Ark gives you 3,000 points on your first capture, with each capture afterwards increasing by 1,000 or 500 depending on the mode. And I believe at the moment for most arcs it's 1,000. But we'll get to the details of the scoring later in the video. This can respawn 8 minutes after capture, with a 15-minute timer to capture it after you grab it. This means that you can't just hold it for the whole match unless you're able to juggle it with another march. This is a big portion of the game, and it has a potential to be depending on your strategy. Lastly are caravans, which give you resource points to gather from, similarly to a resource node, for those who are low on or out of combat troops to help contribute. But this is really not a huge factor in most set-piece Ark matches. Next, let's talk mechanics. There are a few mechanics to remember for this game, so we're going to go over them quickly. First, capture of a building does not immediately give you points income, both for first occupation and for continuous point gain. To get these points, your occupation timer must count down fully, giving you the points then. This means that taking an enemy building will only deny the enemy points for the first 3 minutes, instead of denying them and giving yourself the points at the same time. After that capture timer, however, you have full control, giving you the points. You can also use this to your advantage by stealing buildings to reset the timer to capture, even if you don't intend to defend, denying the enemy some points. Because even if they come back and recapture it within a minute, they still lose the minute that you had it, plus the 3-minute capture timer and points. Next, let's talk about the Ark mechanics. Capturing the Ark to carry it takes 10 seconds, after which you are saddled with a move speed debuff and a damage vulnerability, making even the tankiest march super weak to attack. This means 2 things. 1, fast marches cannot just run away with the Ark from all the enemies. And 2, you'll need to protect your Ark carrier to secure the capture. This also opens up opportunities for the opposing team, where you don't need to capture the Ark to defeat the enemy, as the increased capture time paired with the damage vulnerability can open up just a huge pitfall for the enemy, forcing them to take upwards of 10 minutes to capture an Ark, and opening up opportunities on the flanks with minimal troop commitments to do this. We will cover this more in depth in the strategy section, but remember that the Ark carrier needs to be thoroughly protected if you're carrying it, as carrying the Ark makes you extremely vulnerable. And of course, the newest mechanic to Ark is the fog. This adds some strategic depth, as you cannot see your enemies and they cannot see you unless they cross within visual range, which is a fairly tight group. Because of this, I highly recommend taking unusual paths if you want to stay hidden and maintain a surprise, as the default pathing will keep most of your enemies in the same general area, keeping you a wide swath to avoid the enemy and sneak up to their defenses undetected, which can be lethal when done well to flank enemy Ark carriers or enemy buildings. Next, let's talk about the phases of Ark of Osiris. Ark can be broken down into 3 main phases: the early game phase, the control phase, and the Ark phase. We will briefly go over the basics of each of these phases. First, of course, is the early game phase. This is the major setup phase of the game, from when the match starts until the obelisks are captured and players start teleporting out. The biggest target for this time is creating pressure on the enemy, if possible, as well as securing your foothold at the obelisks. The ultimate goal, of course, is primarily to secure your obelisk and move on to the next phase cleanly. There are 2 major strategies to do this, which we will go over in the strategies section of the video. Next is the control phase. This is where you and the enemy team fight for control of buildings on the map. This constitutes the vast majority of your scoring, about 70 to 80% depending on your strategy, and you will likely win or lose the game in this phase. Controlling buildings is the single most consistent source of points for yourself, as well as the single most consistent way to build a lead on your enemy or to close the gap. If you are struggling to win Ark matches, this is likely the phase where you'll want to focus on and improve your strategies. The way you attack enemy buildings will be determined primarily by your team size, but also may be determined by the strength of the enemy garrisons. All that being said, you also have remarkable freedom of strategy here, able to implement whatever strategy works best for you, your kingdom, and your alliance to reach the objective, as long as you're able to achieve those goals. Last, but certainly not least, we have the namesake for the game mode, the Ark phase. This is the time between the preceding minutes, about 4 or 5 minutes before the Ark spawns, and when the Ark spawns itself, all the way up until it's captured. The control phase continues during this time, but the Ark also is in play. You can implement any number of strategies for this phase as well. However, each strategy also takes manpower away from the control side, so you'll need to choose your commitment and your balance of strategy wisely, as the Ark phase can also make or break your push and success based on how much it impedes your control phase. Next, let's talk about skills. There are a bevy of skills in the Ark of Osiris, and each is different in its goals and use. Quickly, we'll go over each skill. First, there are movement skills. In starting, we'll do running charge and swift stride. These both have the same goal, increasing movement speed for your allies. Running charge is an AoE with greater move speed boost, but can only target limited targets, while swift stride is a blanket effect which is better for larger areas where multiple movements are being made in different areas of the map. The most common use of these skills are to help increase the move speed of the Ark carrier and the group protecting the Ark, but it also has use to help speed up rallies, speed up garrison marches trying to reinforce a building, or if the fights are isolated in multiple groups, as well as helping chase down enemy Ark carriers. Of the two, running charge is solid, but I personally prefer swift stride for the blanket effect, as if you have a large number of troops in the field area, you might not get the intended target with the speed boost, as well as increasing the pressure on the wings if you're keeping rallies going during the Ark phase. Next is hard push, with increased march speed to allied rallies by 50% and damage by 30% for 10 minutes on a 10-minute cooldown. This used to be the must-have for all Ark teams due to the decreased capture timer, but even without the decreased capture timer, I still believe it's a must-have for teams that use coordinated rallies. With the 100% uptime potential and the damage and move speed boost, it keeps pressure up and can add up quickly for rallies on an enemy defense, as well as potentially beating defenses to locations in the early stages of the game. Next, we have the building skills. These are Teardown and Valiant Stand. Teardown increases the attack of anybody attacking a target building by 80% for 5 minutes, while Valiant Stand increases the defense of troops within the building by 50% for 5 minutes. These essentially cancel each other out, with the 1.5% attack per defense ratio being about the trade ratio these stats give during normal situations. So if you choose to include this skill, it's ultimately a matter of preference. My preference of the two is Valiant Stand, but both last the same amount of time, have the same cooldown, same bars, and overall just give you the same result. So it really comes down to personal preference. Next, we have the field skills. War Drums, Mystical Formation, Dust Up, which we have way down here, Bog Down, which we have back up here, Heaven's Grace, and Total Vision. These are all over the place on this, but we're going to go over them one by one, and there's just a lot of variety here. You have coverage. War Drums first gives a flat 80% attack to up to 30 troops for 3 minutes on a 10-minute cooldown. This is solid for fighting in the middle, fighting when you're swarming, or just overall anytime you can make a large group of troops. Since the Ark carrier already has so much increased damage, I also love this for tracking down the enemy Ark carrier and stalling if you're using a stall tactic. I like this skill overall due to the smaller field forces our team implements, but it is limited to 30, so if you're running groups of 50 or more, you're not going to get nearly as much benefit from this use as you would some other skills. Next is Mystical Formation, which is the same as War Drums as I talked about, but with 50% defense instead of 80% attack. Of the two, I do prefer Mystical Formation, as it just generally covers better situations, because even if you're trying to chase down an Ark carrier, the increased defense will prevent enemies from swarming you down before you get there. But overall, again, it's going to come down to your personal preference. I just tend to prefer defense over attack. Next, we have Dust Up. I wanted to include this alongside the other two because it does something a little more along those lines than the other skills do. Dust Up decreases the visual range of the enemy, which is pretty useful, as well as the damage by 10%, which is really, really great. A 10% damage reduction by the enemies everywhere is a sneakily solid skill, as it targets all enemy troops, including rallies, lasts 3 minutes, and decreases visual range. At 2 bars of cost, this is a super underrated skill, as it has many uses and many niches, as the visual range can help allies escape, can help your allied marches get to a target without them being able to see it and get down. They prevent enemies from stopping your marches from going to the enemy Ark carrier, and impedes your enemies all over the field at once, giving a ton of good value. Next, we have Bog Down, which gives a defense debuff of 50% to an area, as well as a march speed reduction by 30%. You can only target 30 marches with this, which means huge field marches. You're not going to get as much utility. But this is essentially an anti-version of Mystical Formation with the slow, but can only be targeted within the area. So once a march leaves it, you no longer have the debuff. However, you can use this to control enemies by slowing them down, by placing it in the center, but you can also crowd control enemies by putting it between them and their intended target to try to displace them. Because then they have to choose between walking through the snare or to go around it and go to a different location which you may have better reinforced, which you can then get the maximized slow on the enemy either way, as well as a defense debuff that can help you melt unsuspecting enemies, especially Ark carriers. If you pair this with War Drums or Mystical Formation on your side, it can be deadly as well, as you essentially double the advantage either of these skills give you, while impeding the enemy's ability to escape. Next, Heaven's Grace is a very, very niche field skill, which I don't really care for. It heals a portion of slightly wounded units per second for 20 seconds. At a 4-bar cost, that heals slightly wounded, not severely, and comes on a 20-minute cooldown. It makes it not nearly as viable. Ark tends to lend itself to a ton of severely wounded already, which then reduces the group of slightly wounded units that you can heal with this. Add on that troops have to be in the field for it to work. They have to be wounded for them to be healed, as well as a massive cooldown and large cost. Heaven's Grace is just a little too niche for most team strategies to use it very well. It does, however, have a distinct niche in the Field Swarmer meta, where marches are coming around swarming, because you can make them sustain a little longer. Lastly, Total Vision somewhat falls into this category because it doesn't neatly fall into another. With a buff to visual range of 20%, buff to visual range and 20% allied troop damage to boost all allies for 180 seconds. Besides the 4 action bar cost, this is also an excellent skill, although it does come on a 15-minute cooldown, which really makes it harder to use. The 20% damage is on par with like Hard Push, and you can stack it with Hard Push if you so choose. But the visual range doesn't do a lot for you versus the 4 action bar cost, which makes it a little more hard to justify for a lot of teams. Next, we're going to talk about map affecting skills. These are major map effects that typically have 60-minute cooldowns and have more distinct impacts on the game. When used well, they can certainly be impactful, but used poorly, they can hamstring your capabilities with all the action bars you're going to use. First, we have Desert Storm. This is an AoE that does a damage factor of 1000 to up to 30 enemy troops within an area over 10 seconds. This doesn't really do a lot for the fact that it also carries a massive 13-minute cooldown and costs 4 skill bars. And sure, the biggest thing that's used for is to essentially knock down weakened Ark carriers. But outside of that, it really doesn't do a lot for you, besides maybe chip damaging some enemies. And because of that, it tends to fall to the wayside based on the cost and the impact. Next, Sneaky Tactics gives 50% march speed and a hidden effect, which basically masks your troops from being able to be seen. Troops carrying the Ark of Osiris cannot be hidden, of course. And if a troop attacks, they then lose the hidden and gain 30% damage for 60 seconds. This was good in theory, but overall I don't really care for it because outside of ambushing Ark carriers, it carries a lot of risk as wide a niche as other skills have. And it comes with a 15-minute cooldown. And the 4-bar cost is better than like a 6-bar cost. But a lot of times the best use case is based on the enemy having the Ark, which is not a good spot for you to be in already. It does have some niche as well for swarming buildings, since you can use the damage buff after you pop out of hidden. That being said, most of the best use cases are disadvantageous to be in the first place, meaning you want to put yourself at a disadvantage to make use of it, which is really risky to throw into your selections. Next is probably the most popular of these, is To the Death. It gives 30 allied troops 100% damage and 30% damage reduction at the cost of not being able to be healed. This also means that this is also a once per arc skill at 6 cost as well. So it's an interesting skill, and it's one of the best, but it only has a 60-second uptime out of the whole match, since you can only use it once per game. It can win or lose a arc fight in the middle, but the cost is significant and requires neglecting a lot of other skills and a lot of other uptime to build up to it. as well as only being good for a one-time use. A misuse or early use of the skill before an engagement can really destroy your efforts. Most of the time, I would say avoid the skill, as you can make better use of War Drums and Mystical Formation combined, where you can then use the skills multiple times later on in the match, and gives you a more even result overall and keeps your trades more steady over the course of the whole match instead of this one fight. Lastly, in this category, we have Master Strategy. This is a very, very unique skill. It gives a teleport of 30 troops to one location, giving them 50% attack for 3 minutes at the cost of 6 bars at once, and once per match. This is honestly one of the worst skills, I think, overall for most strategies, as you can just get better results through positioning better in the first place, and then using War Drums and Swift Stride, or running charge, depending on your preference. Gaining extra mobility over the duration, and a greater 30% attack over the 50% the skill provides. All that too, and you get to have the skill again in 10 minutes. Generally speaking, it's just so weak that it wouldn't even be justifiable on a 15-minute cooldown, let alone once a match. So you just have better options overall in most cases, especially if you have plenty of skill slots available. Next, we have the miscellaneous skills, which don't smoothly fit into any of these other areas. Insatiable Desire gives you increased gathering speed when visiting caravans, which is useful, but a 10-minute cooldown on 2 bars is just not really useful in most arcs. And the times it would be useful, you won't find out till you get in the arc that maybe the other team doesn't show up. Hidden Sentry is a 0 cost that gives you a 45 range, just vision area, which is great for trying to see if somebody's sneaking up on you, but it doesn't tip the strategic balance majorly, except in field-heavy arcs, because you can typically anticipate where the enemy's going to want to go. Timely Support increases healing speed by 300% for the 3 minutes on a 12-minute cooldown. At 3 bars, it's not horrible, but if you're not healing in your arcs, there's really no reason to use this. And if you're planning on using speed ups for your arcs and smaller arcs, I would probably recommend not doing that, because win or loss, you're going to get rewards. But in the highly competitive arcs in like Osiris League, this is probably a more viable option. But if you're just playing with your friends, you're probably not going to use Timely Support, just because you're better off saving those speed ups for KvK. So how should you balance these skills? Well, ideally, you should probably have one of each of the major 3 skill categories, being movement skills, field skills, and building skills. With the exception of course, the major skills and miscellaneous skills, because they're so specific in overall just one area of expertise, you may not need them. This means you'll want, like I said, a movement skill, a field skill, and a building skill at a minimum. If you aren't particularly in love with any of the miscellaneous or major skills, you can instead run 2 of each, or some kind of combination of the main 3 skill types. For my arc, I prefer 2 movement skills, 3 field skills, and 1 building skill. Movement skills are utility heavy that benefits everything but garrisons. Field skills can support garrisons, but also help you in the middle, and definitely can support rallies. And building skills can be used to help garrisons directly through the use of Valiant Stand, giving each setup a chance to cover as many bases as possible. For my arc, I specifically use Swift Stride and Hard Push for my movement skills, War Drums, Mystical Formation, and Dust Up for my field skills, and then Valiant Stand for my building skills. I feel that I get really good coverage and value with this setup, while the low overall costs help me be flexible in being able to respond to situations as they come up, and better help my team to succeed, while a mistaken skill doesn't really handicap my team nearly as badly. That being said, different skill sets will work for different setups, so experiment and find what fits your personal preferences. Now, let's talk strategies. For each of these phases, as I discussed earlier, I'll go over some common strategies implemented, as well as the pros and cons of these strategies. First, in the early game, there are a few strategies you can use here. All of them include, and I cannot recommend this enough, using a player with a 1-unit T1 Horseman march to march to your obelisk as quickly as possible using Windswept and some combination of mobility commanders. This does not have to be a particularly strong player, just one who has a Windswept set and max mobility. The reasoning is that the capture timer we discussed earlier starts as soon as the first capture happens, so the full mobility will capture it sooner, taking seconds off the clock, which may not seem like much, but it could be the difference between a victory and a defeat on your first obelisk defense, depending on the enemy setup. After this common ground, the strategy can vary. There are two main mentalities, the offensive and the defensive. The defensive consists of sending a strong defense inside a mobile rally, such as Jan Nevsky in a full cav rally, to your own defensive obelisk to secure it until it's time to teleport out. This is conservative, but guarantees your transition into the control phase. This rally will continue to march even if the building is captured, so you don't have to worry about your fast march messing anything up. This also counteracts the aggressive strategy if your enemy uses it, which we'll go over next. For the aggressive strategy, you'll want to send a strong rally, with or without a garrison, to the enemy obelisk at the start. You can still use the defensive strategy alongside this, should you have the numbers. Just make sure you don't commit any desperately needed marches to the aggressive rally, lest you lose them to the enemy obelisk if you take it, or lest you lose them while they're marching back. The idea with the aggressive strategy is to pressure the enemy, if not overwhelm them outright, early on to delay their capture and delay their transition into the control phase. When done well, this at worst puts pressure on the enemy, and normal results grants you the enemy buildings with little or no defense, and at best can totally cripple an enemy wing and steal an additional 8 teleports for your team to do better. This is also at minimal risk when combined with the defensive strategy, as this is typically what I recommend doing as well. This is also made better with hard push due to the increased march speed and damage. Both strategies can really benefit from that. Next, we're on to the control phase. There are a few major strategies in the control phase, which I will go over briefly. First, of course, is the standard death by rally strategy. This strategy holds tight to rallies using hard push, with all buildings being attacked by rallies. This is more consistent for results, but gives the enemy time to respond and reinforce, meaning you need good rally leaders and good support for it to work. That being said, it is the most consistent way to get results on average, and can be incredibly difficult to deal with if you can get a garrison to march with or inside the rally to give a viable defense once you secure the building. Another common strategy is the wandering swarm strategy. This strategy doesn't utilize rallies as much as utilizing large numbers of allies moving in groups and swarming structures to steal them. This is made particularly effective by fog, as an army can materialize out of nowhere, swarm the buildings, and disappear. This has the advantage of surprise and flexibility with the fog, but it is much harder to hold buildings as the rally strategy, as you're not bringing a full rally to that building to reinforce it, which means you could potentially lose out on points. It also requires good coordination for it to work well. For us, we have found the strategy that works best for us is a combination, where you have a couple of players running the field to help interfere and cause some havoc, while your rallies do a lot of the damage. This way you end up with a solid strategy that can melt away defenses with the rally, and you have the consistency and safety garrisons and rallies provide, while also being able to melt weakened garrisons with the swarmer marches. Last, but certainly not least, is the Ark phase. There are probably more strategies here than anywhere else, and an Ark team can use any number of them, and several of them within a match. I'll go over a couple of the most common here first. The first strategy, of course, is to ignore the Ark altogether. While you do concede the Ark here, you can instead focus all of your troops on the wings, and each troop the enemy contributes to the middle is now a troop that's not contributing on the wings, giving you a better chance to win buildings and getting more consistent source of points. When done well, you force the enemy into a losing situation where they have to either ignore the Ark and fight on the wings, or capture the Ark and lose buildings on the wings, forcing them to either way to try to not do what they wanted in their standard strategy. For this method, I do recommend, if possible, sending a person or two to the middle still, either via a dedicated player in the middle team, or just a few marches to focus down the enemy Ark carrier and stall for time. The reason here being, the longer you can make it for them to capture their building using the strategy, the more your building point advantage will come into play. For example, if you have 700 points per minute and they have 400 points per minute, you're gaining 300 a minute on them. Meaning if you can make it take 5 minutes to capture the Ark, that's 1,500 points. If you can maintain that building until the next Ark spawns, that's another 8 minutes. So that is another 2,400 points. So now you've created a 3,900 point advantage just like that by stalling the Ark carrier. The longer you can make it to get time to capture using the strategy, the better the advantage will just be. And that leads us to our next strategy, just the full stall strategy. This strategy consists of a handful of players waiting for the enemy to grab the Ark, then swarming them down quickly, while most allies will trickle in to do the same. This mostly works best under the similar conditions as ignoring the Ark, but it takes some coordination, and when coordinated well, it can be completely devastating to the enemy. Especially with fog, you can pop up out of nowhere and just start creating all sorts of issues. The additional wrinkle to the strategy is, if you use multiple marches, you can swarm whatever building they're going to prevent them from capturing it and force them to walk even longer. And whatever you can do in these cases to slow down the enemy, it ends up being better. This, again, it can be used, it's best used when you have a point advantage, because then you could just further use your point advantage. And then if you steal the Ark, you just try to capture it if you can, that's great. If not, you run it further away from the nearest building, further increasing the time. This takes a lot of coordination, because if you have too much commitment, you lose your strength on the wings, and then you lose the advantage. But when coordinated well, it can be devastated. And of course, last but certainly not least, is the full commitment strategy. In this strategy, players leave the wings to fight for the Ark, trying to secure it by whatever means necessary. This comes with the pro of having a much better chance of capturing the Ark, but this is typically also where you can lose a match, because if you don't reinforce buildings and you lose them, you start losing points back to the enemy. So because of this, I do recommend you reinforcing some buildings, even with like half strength, if you're going to send as many marches to the middle, so that a wandering, swarming march can't just take a building and deny you those points. The upside, of course, is capturing an Ark can win you the match if you're close, but typically I don't recommend you using this strategy unless you are just down to the wire and that's the only way you can win, because the sheer troop commitment to win it guaranteed is just inefficient, and you're better off investing those troops into controlling buildings for the first 75 to 80% of the match, because the point income you can gain from that is just generally better overall. Now we're on to team planning. When it comes to team planning, you have a few general strategies. First comes the decision to have a dedicated middle team or not. The middle team is utilized for Ark, but the majority of the match, they don't do a lot in terms of point income outside of holding outposts. So if you decide to implement a middle team, I recommend either keeping the number small and moving players to the middle during Ark contesting times if you want to do a more hefty commitment, or using them to do field interference in between Ark matches, or Ark spawns. Next is how do you balance your wings. Each wing has to operate mostly independent from one another, since each wing is separated by a significant distance. So you want to make sure that you have an equal number of garrisons and rallies if possible on both sides. You don't want one side with 6 garrisons and one side with 0, as it will really hamper your ability to fight. If possible, you should also balance your troop types for rallies and garrisons, as filling 3 archer rallies is harder to do than 1 archer, 1 cav, and 1 infantry, especially later on in the match. So take that to heart when you try to balance your teams. Sometimes there's just not a good answer, and that's okay. But try to eliminate those issues as often as you can, and your teams will thank you for it. Lastly, let's talk about team sizing. There are 2 major strategies that Ark team balancers use when they're designing their teams. The first is the balanced team. As the name would suggest, this involves balancing the remaining players outside of the middle team as much as possible. Rallies and garrisons, as I mentioned, but also power, leadership, and everything else that you can manage to split evenly. This ensures that both sides are equally capable and have an equal chance of winning. This also means that if one side is significantly stronger for the enemy side, that side on your side will be a little more disadvantaged, making the fight a little more difficult. But that being said, that's where the balance comes in, as you'll have more coverage to react and counteract those enemies. The other strategy, which is unique and still used from time to time by us, is the oblique strategy. Named after the oblique order tactics used by the Greeks and then later by Belisarius, the oblique order loads one wing as fairly shallow, while the other wing is loaded heavily in a formation, with the goal of the heavier side overwhelming the enemy before the weaker side collapses. You can utilize this strategy in an Ark team planning as well. Similarly to the real-life strategy, this strategy only succeeds if you have good leadership on the weakened wing, as holding that wing for as long as possible is the key to success and is fairly difficult. But if done well, your defensive wing will focus on holding their own buildings and maybe opportunistically stealing one of the enemy buildings, while the other wing tries to push through the enemy and take all of theirs. While this strategy is risky, it minimizes your chances of being overwhelmed by a stronger enemy on one wing, as your stout defense on the weaker wing only has to deny the enemy's control of your defensive buildings, while the increased numbers on the other wing help even the odds on a much greater strength enemy and give them a chance to succeed. In this case, however, you are also much more dependent on the Ark, as the margin for error is much smaller in these cases due to the fact that you are giving up and conceding the wing's points on one side. That being said, the strategy is also typically implemented in situations where the enemy is at a decided advantage in troop quality or troop quantity, so the margin for error is already small in these situations. In either case, I recommend keeping the middle team small, using 1 to 2 with a maximum of 3 if you're registering less than 20 people, and a maximum of 4 in groups of 20 plus. For the wings, you can either split them evenly for the balanced, with an odd number of players having 1 or 3 middle team members, or an even number of players having 2 or 4. And then for the oblique setup, setting up a ratio of about 2 or 1.5 to 1, meaning that the strengthened wing of 15 players would be 10 on the strengthened wing and 5 on the weak, or 9 and 6, with 9 to 6 being typically what we use when we do the oblique setup for our teams. When you do this too, make sure you stack good leadership on both wings, even for the oblique strategy, but make sure that the leadership on the oblique side with the weakened wing is also very well coordinated, because they will need to keep players motivated, because being on the side where you're getting battered is not a fun experience. Lastly, let's go over some general tips to remember for your Ark of Osiris strategies. First, never forget the difference having full control of a building has over just stealing one and not defending. If you are able to fully capture and control a building to occupation, not only are you denying the enemy that position and those points, but you're also gaining those. Controlling all these buildings on your side gives you 590 points per minute. So stealing a building not only gains you whatever the building value is worth, but denies the enemy that as well. For example, an altar at 150 per minute actually gives you 300 per minute point advantage over the enemy, as you get 740 points per minute versus the enemy having 440 since they lost the building. This is also true for your own buildings, which is why defense is extremely important in Ark of Osiris. Even if it's not a garrison, you should endeavor to have something to defend that captured building, as well as your own buildings. To put this into perspective, stealing an enemy altar on both sides gives 600 points per minute difference, making up the cost of 1 Ark capture in 5 minutes, 2 full Ark captures in 12, and all 3, which is typically the maximum, in a 20 minutes of time in an Ark match. This is how oftentimes a team can capture all 3 Arks and still lose pretty handily by neglecting the wings. Tack on stolen outposts, even temporarily, and stolen shrines, and buildings have a huge impact on the result, even if they're not fully held. Which leads to my next thing to remember. Always, always, always be looking for whatever opportunity you can to steal points. Each stolen building, even if not occupied, denies the enemy a certain number of points. Altars, if held for 3 minutes, deny 240 points. But the enemy has to recapture that and have a 3-minute capture timer, meaning you deny another 240 points when they have to recapture it. Meaning that even if the building is not controlled, you still deny 480 points if you get it down to 2 minutes and 59 seconds when they capture. Use this to your advantage and force the enemy to chase themselves in circles. On the flip side, to counteract this, make sure you have a garrison and a few reinforcements, if not outright a full defense, in every building you control. This prevents small swarmers, it prevents Ark carriers from reaching that building, and the damage vulnerability will surely demolish that march if they try to swarm it. And it forces the enemy to regroup, securing the building while the enemy musters a force or mobilizes a rally. And that might buy you 3 minutes, which could buy you 450 points if you're controlling an altar. These little things, 200 points here and 200 points there, can add up quickly, and is often the difference between a new Ark match leader and an experienced one. I have personally had around a dozen matches that go down to the wire, and During our longest win streak in 2057 of 19 or 20 matches, we had 3 or 4 that came down within 1,000 to a few hundred points, even against stronger enemies. But with that, we'll conclude our discussion on Ark. There is much more I could discuss, but I would surely keep you guys here forever with endless rambling. Lastly, I will leave you with my last and possibly most important thing to remember. Above all else is don't worry about what the matchup says. Ultimately, you can't control the matchup, and neither can anybody else in that match. You can, however, control your strategies, your play, and how you approach each decision from start to finish in that match. A level head and a calm mind are the best tools you can have in Ark, and in KvK for that matter as well. Take these Ark matches as ways to learn and grow, refine your tactics, build your strengths with your allies, and above all, have fun. Win or lose, you get rewards, so try to learn and grow, but also try to enjoy. Who knows, you might end up rattling off a year-long Ark streak. But let me know what you think. Would you like for me to cover anything else relating to Ark? Let me know in the comments. Also, let me know if you'd like me to cover anything else in the realm of Rise of Kingdoms, as your suggestions could become future video topics. But with that, good luck, fight well, and I will see you on the battlefield.